Welcome to today's call where we are going to dive in deep about the topic of food reactions. And I think this is very relevant because, it's a very common experience for patients, at least patients that I meet and speak with, that they're having or suspecting food reactions. And oftentimes they've even had food testing, like food sensitivity tests, and they're confused about what they should do, what they can eat, what they can't eat. Are the results trustworthy, et cetera, et cetera. So today we're going to dive into that and much, much more. And if you're interested, I've written a book, it's on Amazon, called The Autoimmune Answer, and chapter 8 is all about food allergy, food sensitivities, and food intolerances. And you can get more information on that topic, on those 3 topics, in my book in chapter 8. You can check that out on Amazon, hard copy, soft copy, Kindle version, audiobook. Anything you want, you can get a free download of the audiobook version at my website, www.functionalmedicinecharlotte.com/free, if you'd like. So let's start with those topics, but we're going to branch out from there today as well. So if we take the food reactions topic and go into food testing, food tests, the tests break down to largely 2 types that are worthwhile. And I've made videos on this in the past that I'll link to, but one is food allergy testing, and the other is food sensitivity testing. And to the layperson, this, you might say, well, what's the difference? The difference is in the details for sure. Now, I'm going to cover the food allergy testing and the food sensitivity testing. Specifically, the food allergy testing is based on immunoglobulin E testing, and the food sensitivity testing is based on immunoglobulin G and or immunoglobulin A. And I'm making those distinctions because there are other food tests out there that are called MRT or LRT, lymphocyte response testing, or basically those tests, they're taking a white blood cell in a petri dish and they're poking that white blood cell with broccoli or with cherry or whatever the food is, and seeing what kind of response that immune cell has to it. Those tests are not physiologic, meaning that's not how it happens in real time in our body. So the results are questionable in my mind. Whereas with the food allergy and food sensitivity testing, food exposure to antibodies is how it happens in the body. And so these are more reliable. But the caveat there is that a person must be able to produce enough IgE or IgG or IgA to show us a true positive or a true negative. So there are strengths and weaknesses to every test. And the gold standard still at this time in 2023 of working with food reactions is what's called the elimination provocation diet. That's still the gold standard scientifically, no matter how sexy the marketing pieces from the food testing business companies is, okay? But there is utility for these. So the food allergy test is looking for just that, food allergy. And this means if you have an allergy to a food, you can range from asymptomatic to hives to rash to EpiPen type moments, okay? So an IgE food allergy test is something that your allergist would run and would recognize. They would run blood IgE testing to do that. So they might draw your blood and run pollen-specific IgE, or in the case of food, wheat-specific IgE, or soy or corn or peanut, right? They recognize that stuff because an IgE response is what's called an acute hypersensitivity response. So if you've got an IgE response, there's potential that you could have symptoms all the way up to anaphylaxis and death in their office. So they're worried about that. If you ask your allergist to test you for food sensitivity, they may roll their eyes and just say, oh, it's a fad, whatever, it's not real. The reason That's not true, but the reason they're not interested in sensitivities is because that is a delayed hypersensitivity reaction, meaning it could take 7 to 10 days after you eat something for you to have a sensitivity response to it. Obviously, by then you would be long gone from the allergist's office, so it's really hard for them to see right away. Okay, and it's not going to kill you today or even in 7 to 10 days, so they're not as worried about it. But as many people have experienced, even though it may not kill you acutely, it can wreck your quality of life acutely and promote things like gas, bloating, diarrhea, constipation, GI pain, inflammation, many other things. So those tests can be useful if we understand what your immune system looks like. And that's beyond the scope of this video, but I've made videos on that in the past. And so you can look at those on the YouTube channel. Another type of food reaction that can be tested for somewhat is food intolerance. Okay. And where the food allergy and food sensitivity tests are immune based, these are immune responses to food. The food intolerance is not an immune based response. These are more things like problems with enzymes. And a classic example is lactose intolerance. Okay. If someone is lactose intolerant, they don't do what they don't do well with dairy because of the dairy sugar lactose. And they don't do well with lactose because they lack the enzyme lactase. And lactase is the enzyme that breaks down the lactose. So if they don't have lactase, they don't break down lactose well, and they become lactose, or they are lactose intolerant and have symptoms related to that. There's other ones, other food intolerances, such as histamine intolerance, or I'm blanking right now, tyramine intolerance. So there's monosodium glutamate intolerance. There's different intolerances in different people. And so if you know or experience symptoms repeatedly when you have dairy, and maybe you don't have lab high IgG, IgA, or IgE to it, perhaps it's a lactose intolerance, and they could test you for that. Or you could just avoid dairy, right? So those are food tests that you could consider if you're having food reactions. What if you are having food reactions and all three of these things checked out fine, right? Then what? Then you're frustrated because it's like, hey, they're telling me I'm normal. All my tests have been normal. But every time I eat dairy or eggs or a strawberry, whatever it is, I notice a symptom. Well, you might have something else going on. So let's change our colors. So if it's not an immune response to food or an immune antibody response to food or an intolerance, perhaps you have a gut issue. Okay, so if we zoom in on the gut to look at your GI tract, and we draw it like this, and we can see one layer of epithelial cells down here. And epithelial cells are the cells that line your gut. So if you were to have leaky gut, you'd have a breakage in these cells. And up here we have the same thing. Another layer. Okay, so the gut is a tube, right? And so if we look at it this way, right, we're going this way through the tube. And so you have a roof to the tube up here, and you have a floor to the tube down here. And this is the space in the tube, or the lumen, as it's called. Okay, so this tube, if we extended it, right, if this was you, and you ate food in your mouth, it would enter your mouth and you'd swallow it and go down your esophagus, into your stomach, into your small intestine, right? So esophagus, stomach, small intestine. And now we're in the intestine. Make sense? And in the small intestine, we have these finger-like projections coming off our epithelial cells called villi. And that will be important in a little while, but I'll draw them on here now. All right. So we swallow our food, it goes through the esophagus, through the stomach, into the small intestine. So let me just erase lumen here, give us some space. And we'll go back to our drawing. So what if we're having food reactions, but all of our testing tests out clean? Okay, then we can consider the gut. So in the gut, we have food, and say we have, this is a chunk of food here. Well, say you have intestinal hyperpermeability, which is the nerdy name for, what lay people call leaky gut, or Google, if you Google, all the blogs call it leaky gut. Okay. If you have leaky gut, what happens is you've got hyperpermeability. So in a normal gut, you've got some permeability. Some things get through normally. Okay. It's permeable. Things can get in and get out, but not everything should be able to, and not large things shouldn't be able to. Say you have a break between cells here, or you have a break through a cell here. Okay. Now, if you have a food, let's call this, whatever, this could be any food you want to be. This food chunk is too big to get through a normal permeability gut barrier. Okay, it needs to be broken down further from where it is right now by pancreatic enzymes and brush border enzymes to be small enough to be absorbed through the barrier. If this big protein is able to get through somehow through a paracellular break or a transcellular break, paracellular being between cells, transcellular being through a cell. Now, when it's in here, remember up here was the lumen. That's still outside your body, right? Because it is swallowed and down the tube. The inside this tube is still outside your body. But once you break in through the barrier, now you're in an area called the lamina propria. And you don't have to remember that name, but why that's important is because that's where our immune system is waiting and sitting. Okay, so if we've got immune cells here and a protein gets through that shouldn't, now what they're going to do is they're going to produce a bunch of inflammation. So they're going to release inflammatory cytokines to sound off the inflammatory fire alarm and to destroy this protein that shouldn't be getting through. And in so doing, if you've got leaky gut and this is happening at a high enough level, that inflammation may spill over into the GI, and now you have gas, bloating, diarrhea, constipation, bleeding. If it lasts chronically enough, that can promote GI autoimmunity, like maybe a Crohn's or ulcerative colitis or celiac disease. If it goes long enough down here below the lamina propria, you've got blood vessels. So if this protein or the inflammatory contents were to make it into the blood, that can drive systemic inflammation. And now it could impact your brain, it could impact other parts of your body because the inflammation is now going everywhere. Okay, so leaky gut, quote unquote, can be a cause of food reactions, not because there's anything inherently wrong with this piece of food, but because this piece of food, this chunk of it is too big and got somewhere where it's not supposed to be. So, I've used this metaphor before in other videos. If this food, let's call this a strawberry at this point, okay? There's nothing inherently wrong with this strawberry. There's no reason for the immune system to attack it as it is, okay? But if this strawberry goes somewhere where it's not supposed to be, there's consequences. So picture it like if this strawberry is your friend, Bob, right? And you don't mind having Bob over, you invite him over, you have him up on your porch frequently for a glass of lemonade and to talk about old times, and it's no big deal. But what if one night you came home and Bob was inside your house, sitting on your recliner, eating your celery and hummus, right? Now Bob is somewhere where he wasn't invited, and that might make you mad, and you might grab him and throw him out of your house, right? He might cause an inflammatory attitude from you. Same idea. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with Bob. It's just if Bob goes where he's not supposed to go, consequences happen. Okay. And so in this case, what you need to deal with is whatever the causes of the hyperpermeability or the breaks in the gut barrier are. And those are many: antibiotics, glyphosate, stress, autoimmunity, all kinds of different things. So you'd want to deal with those things and promote healthy intestinal barrier function to heal these leaks. And then Bob can't get in where he shouldn't be. That makes sense? So that is another way that you could be having food reactions that is not related to, say, allergy or sensitivity. Now, a third reason could be digestive issues. Okay, so if we have digestion issues, and where do these start? These might start all the way up here in the mouth. So digestion begins in the mouth with chewing. If you don't chew your food sufficiently, now you're swallowing big chunks of food that take more work to break down to get them small enough to finally be absorbed down here. Or that may not happen if you don't chew sufficiently. So chewing is number one. And then also in the mouth, we've got enzymes like salivary amylase that helps break down the carbohydrates, begin the carbohydrate digestion in the mouth. Then that food goes down the esophagus into the stomach here. And in the stomach is a cauldron of acid, right? It's producing hydrochloric acid and pepsin and trypsin and chymotrypsin, all kinds of stuff you've probably never heard of. Okay, but basically the protein is the main protein digester in the GI tract. Okay, this is where the large part of the protein digestion should start and occur. And so if you've got not enough stomach acid, then your protein may not be broken down small enough, and then it moves into the small intestine, and it might feel like a brick or a rock in there. Okay, so now that maldigested protein feels like a brick in there in your gut. All right, and if you've got too many bugs up here, they might ferment that protein and produce gas. Okay, and if the gas is methane, that promotes constipation. If it's hydrogen, that promotes diarrhea. Okay, and it could also promote gas, bloating, diarrhea, along with the diarrhea, constipation, and that could lead to SIBO. Okay, so your food reaction, your gas and bloating may not be due to an allergy or sensitivity. It may be to not enough stomach acid production or poor chewing that leads to large protein fragments making it into the small intestine that are then fermented by bugs, leading to gases and bacterial overgrowth. That's another way. Or say you've got autoimmune attack on the stomach. Okay, pernicious anemia is one, or parietal cell antibodies. If you've got autoimmune attack on the parietal cells, those are the cells that make the stomach acid. So if you're destroying those, that can lead to lower stomach acid, which then feeds forward into the loop we just described. Or say you're someone that has acid reflux or heartburn or GERD, and your doctor prescribed proton pump inhibiting drugs or PPIs. Well, PPIs are drugs that suppress stomach acid. So now you're on a drug that is driving down your acid, so you have insufficient protein digestion, and we're off to the races there. And PPIs are associated with SIBO occurrence. They're associated with kidney disease and liver cancer and increased risk of COVID severity and all kinds of bad things. Proton pump inhibiting drugs like your Nexium and omeprazole and pantoprazole and all those should only be taken for like 2 weeks max. And I see patients all the time that come in and say they've been on them for years. That's bad. They're also tied to dementia as well. So if you're on a proton pump inhibiting medication, it's been more than 2 weeks, you really need to speak to your prescriber and say, how much longer do you want me on this? And what information do you have for me on the possible side effects and adverse effects? Because there are many. So not enough stomach acid can be a big issue. What about the pancreas? Okay. If we've got the pancreas here, the pancreas connects to the intestine here, and it dumps pancreatic enzymes into the intestine, right? So if you have low pancreatic enzymes, that's not good, because the pancreatic enzymes, amylase, lipase, okay, other proteases. So these enzymes digest your carbs, your fats, and your proteins. Well, if your pancreas isn't working properly and it's not secreting enough pancreatic enzymes, you may have a problem with digestion at the level of the intestine, okay, and the duodenum and the jejunum. And so the pancreas should take these big chunks of carbohydrates and fats along and start breaking them down, okay? And then you also have up here, you also have a gallbladder, okay? And the gallbladder also is secreting bile acids in there to help emulsify and break down fats. So we have gallbladder helps break down fats, okay? So any pancreas issue that's affecting the exocrine pancreas, or the enzyme production, could lead to carb, fat, protein digestion issues. A gallbladder issue leads to fat digestion issues, okay? And symptoms of that, can be floating stools. Maybe your stools look tan. Multiple potential symptoms, maybe burping. If you've ever taken fish oil and you've had fishy burps, that could be bile related and gallbladder related sometimes. So issues in those areas could lead to food reactions because the food fragment is too big and not broken down small enough as it should be. And if that's not digested well, then the immune system may have to quote unquote digest it. And in that case, the immune system's digesting it with inflammation, and you're not getting the nutrients from the food you want, plus you've got inflammation. So double whammy there. And then lastly, we've got, like we talked about before, we've got this brush border layer in the intestine. And this brush border produces what's called brush border enzymes. So this is the last step in breaking down the food fragment. So we should be breaking it down smaller and smaller and smaller so it can be absorbed through, and those nutrients can be taken in and used. So even if you have no problem with anything we've talked about to this point, but you've got poor brush border enzyme production, you can have food reactions, you can have symptoms. And celiac disease or Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, that leads to damage of the villi. And so they flatten out and you don't get the enzyme production. And so now small foods like simple sugars drive GI symptoms and may drive bleeding and Crohn's disease or pain or those things. And so one diet that helps some Crohn's disease patients is called the specific carbohydrate diet. And that diet is focused on, avoiding carbs that are complex, that can't be absorbed through this intestinal barrier because you lack the brush border enzymes. So I know this is it's a lot of physiology and digestion, but I hope it helps you understand that the last piece here would be the brush border enzymes from the intestinal villi. Okay. So these are multiple points that need to be looked at and considered or investigated by a doctor that's working with you to help with your quote unquote food reactions. We need to understand, are the food reactions immune-based, and could a food allergy, food sensitivity, food intolerance, or elimination provocation diet take care of that? And if it's not that, is it tied to leaky gut or intestinal permeability? And if so, then we need to find and address the drivers of the permeability and the barrier damage. And or is it digestion issue stemming from poor chewing and or poor stomach acid production and or poor pancreatic and or gallbladder issues, right? And or brush border enzyme issues. So these are various steps in the digestive chain that we can look at. And there's many others that we don't have to go crazy in right now, but things like stress and head injury can play a role here, because stress and head injury, especially if the stress is chronic, you've got your brain up here in this guy's skull, and off the brain, you've got the brain stem, and stress and head injury inhibit what's called the pontomedullary reticular formation, which I've talked about in previous videos and we'll link to here. But the pontomedullary reticular formation we could think of as the vagus nerve mostly, and the vagus nerve drives digestion, drives gut motility, drives an anti-inflammatory environment in the gut. So you may say, hey, I've never had a GI issue and I had a concussion in a fall or in a skiing accident or in a car accident, and ever since then my gut's been a mess and I've had all these food reactions. Well, again, for that person, their quote unquote food reactions are not necessarily anything intrinsically wrong with that piece of food. It may be that the head injury damaged their vagus or drove brain inflammation that's damaging their vagus, and that needs to be taken care of, and you take care of that and the food reactions go away. So before you go and avoid every food on the planet or every food that causes symptoms in you, you want to understand why you're having the symptoms. Because if you just avoid the foods, you're going to have to avoid those foods forever because you're addressing the symptom, right? The idea is to get to where you understand the cause of the reaction, nip that in the bud, and then hopefully you can have those foods back. And that will give you the most diverse diet possible, which typically promotes health. I forgot to mention an H. pylori infection is another, where's my pen here? An H. pylori infection is another common driver of decreased stomach acid, because H. pylori is a bacteria that will damage the parietal cells to decrease the acid to make it a more hospitable environment for itself in the stomach. So yeah, it's more hospitable for the H. pylori, but it's not as good at digesting your protein. So then again, you might have these issues. So I hope this was enlightening for you. I hope you can see what we were getting at with all at this point, it looks like a lot of scribble and chicken scratch. But if you need to follow it again, rewind the video and watch it as many times as you need to. And thank you for watching.